Hi, Muskrat Jim here for episode 2 of Foraging in the Back 40, Other Plants. So let's go see what we can find. Here we have the oyster plant. Now as you can see, the flowers have all gone. So anyway, the rootstock of these plants, something like a dandelion, is edible, as I mentioned in my last video. But it's important to be able to recognize plants throughout their development. So anyway, this is just beyond the peak or beyond the flowering stage of the oyster plant. This is the heal-all plant. What you can do with that is with the flower head and these top leaves, you can brew them into a tea, and apparently it's supposed to heal just about everything. I tried making some about a week ago, and I brewed the flower heads for a while in some boiling water, and it tasted just like honey. It was like as if you just put a teaspoon of honey into a cup of hot water. That's what the flavor was like. It was very mild, but you only tasted it as soon as you swallowed it. So if I ever need honey in my tea, I'll throw a couple of these in. And this is the common plantain. We saw it in our last video. And it's got the deeply veined leaves, and they grow from a central stalk. Well, I mean a central point here. And anyway, it's supposed to grow a tall flower stalk up to about this high. It looks like a stick. And anyway, as you can see, it hasn't sprouted the flower yet. Anyway, these leaves are boiled as a pot herb, and they're really quite tough. So I've tried them a couple of times. You really have to boil them a lot. Like some plants are better if they're eaten raw. Other plants are better if they're boiled for a little bit. And then some plants, like these, require a lot of boiling. Okay, this is a pine tree, and you can see by the long needles. And also, it has a smooth bark. Let's just go over by the trunk here. So there, the bark is relatively smooth, a grayish green. And anyway, these needles can be steeped into a tea. Peterson's book on wild edibles suggests that you should chop the needles up fine and steep them into a tea. But I found that if you leave them whole, it makes it a lot easier to scoop them out of your cup with a fork afterwards. This is a paper birch. As you can tell, it's got the peeling outer birch bark here. The inner bark between the wood and the paper bark is edible. Peterson's book suggests that you dry it and then you crush it into a flour, and then you can bake with it. I read one book where it suggested that you can cut it off in thin strips, like thin vertical, like if you were to cut like thin vertical strips of the inner bark, you can boil that and it would be something like a spaghetti. I haven't actually tried it myself, but it is something that I do want to try. Birch sap is also something that you can collect in the spring. If you just make a cut in the bark, it'll just run. And it's quite sweet as well. It'd be something like maple sap. So I would imagine that the inner bark has that sort of an agreeable flavor as well. A lot of plants that are listed as edible aren't very tasty. They have like a really, really strong flavor. One, for example, would be pine sap. Pine sap or spruce sap, like the gum, the stuff that hangs off the bark. Anyway, it's incredibly, well, it's supposed to be incredibly nutritious, but it's really, really strong tasting, and I really can't stand it myself. But in a survival situation, I know that if I had nothing else, I would at least have that. This is a familiar oxeye daisy. Now, the only thing you can do with these is the young leaves are actually a pot herb, so you can boil those up. The leaves are kind of long and skinny with a bunch of lobes on them. Anyway, those, I've never tasted them myself, but Peterson says that it is edible. This is the fruit of an apple tree. As you can tell, they're hard to mistake. The leaves are oval. They're not, or they're really finely toothed, and the bark they're not really thorns, but they do have little lumps all over them. They would be like a thorn, and the bark of the tree is actually quite rough. Just zoom in here. See, the bark there is really rough, and it has like scales that can be broken off, that sort of thing.